So it is a wonderful morning to be together to study from the Word of the Lord. And Happy New Year to everybody. It's the first Sunday in 2019. We are in Genesis chapter 29. Genesis 29. We're continuing our study of the Law of Moses. We're starting with the narrative portions of the law. So we're going to go through Genesis and Exodus. We will pick out the narrative bits from Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And once we have finished the story part of the law, then we'll turn our attention to the legal part of the law, or the laws themselves, as it were. So right now, in total, the Law of Moses gives us a sense of who Israel ought to be. Right? It is Israel's founding document, as it were. Right? Whenever we think of founding documents, so we think of things like our Constitution, right? We typically think of things that are purely legal in nature, things that describe how our government is supposed to work. But whenever we think about it, we also recognize that there's more to our story than just the laws that make up our country, right? Because along with our founding documents, we also usually count, say, the Declaration of Independence, right? And what laws are contained in the Declaration of Independence? Well, it's not a legal document in the sense that it's not establishing law for people to follow in the United States. It's a legal document in the sense that it is a legal appeal against the king. Right, but that document's also telling a story. That we have been sorely abused by the king, and we're not going to have it anymore. And so we declare our independence. In the Law of Moses, we find something similar in that we're getting Israel's backstory, the identity of who they are, where they come from, and we're also getting the laws that are supposed to govern the nation. Yeah, Tom.
Also, in that situation, you've got a period of history that goes up that leads to that and sets all the groundwork.
Right.
Genesis, everything that we're doing through Genesis.
It's all groundwork.
It's all groundwork. Our Constitution goes back to really...
It goes way back.
It goes back to basically the,
Magna Carta and even before then.
Decided, Galileo said that the earth was round and people started exploring and then,
right.
Traveled around and basically Columbus, petitioned the Queen, Queen of Spain to come through. All
right.
Tied into our independence.
Right.
And many countries came into play that. And here you're seeing this same thing to come in. We're going to see Egypt come on to play pretty soon, and then you start to see northern kings, all leading up to all that history around the laws that God made for us.
Yeah.
If we do that sort of parallel type of situation, we see that with our country as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The Constitution and our laws suggest a much bigger story behind them. And similarly, whenever we look at the laws that are contained in the Law of Moses, like we mentioned on Thursday, Leviticus 18:18. Leviticus 18:18, relatively simple, short law. And you shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is still alive. Right? It's a law. Pretty simple rule. Don't take a woman as a rival wife to her sister. In other words, don't marry a woman and then marry her sister also as a second wife. All right, but obviously there is a big story sitting behind that law, making sense of that law, and it's the story that we're going to enter into this morning in Genesis chapter 29. You can look at Genesis 29 in a sense as like case law. right, what happens whenever you violate this principle? Right, now obviously the law of Moses is not in force whenever Jacob is doing what he's doing. Right, but the story of what Jacob is doing is part of the law. Right, it's an explanation for Israel. This is where you've come from, and also you can also consider these stories in terms of the laws. You can consider the laws in terms of the stories. These are meant to not only teach Israel who they are, but also who they are to be. And so Moses is telling Israel, you've come from Jacob, you have come from this mess, this is your background, but look at this mess. You don't want to live this mess out again in your own personal life. Right? It worked for Jacob only in a sense because God made it work. Again, God didn't sanctify it. God didn't say, oh yeah, it's great that you married rival wives and you married their servants and you had 4 wives and you had this big mess. But God was able to take that big mess and give us the patriarchs. Yeah, Wayne?
Do you think, I don't know, it seems to allude to the fact, to a fact, that there could perhaps have been a written law or code that everyone was familiar with that dated from way back when. We don't have a record of it in our Bible that they would have been familiar with in a cultural, social, cultural law. We told them, well, this is right, that's right, that's not. But Cain knew which way, Cain and Abel, they knew which one was the right sacrifice and which one, they were different. So, was there something given, maybe that covered all this stuff? At some point, I think between reading the narratives and actually digging into the laws, we'll need to spend some time looking at ancient Near Eastern law. Because we do have a lot of ancient law codes that predate the law of Moses that the people of the area would have been familiar with. And from what I remember, there's a couple of instances where you can tell that Abraham is familiar with the laws of Hammurabi. I forget exactly what they were off the top of my head. But we have a lot of law codes. Hammurabi's the most famous one. Comes from way before Moses. Comes from the region surrounding Babylon. But we also have laws from Middle Assyria. We have I think we do have some copies of Egyptian laws. Let's see. We also have copies of Hittite laws. And this sort of situation is loosely covered in those laws. Right? We know from those laws that it was common practice for wealthy men to marry more than one woman. Right? We know that as like a cultural background. So no one would have been frowning at Jacob whenever he did the things that he did. But it's revealed to Israel through Moses that this is actually not the way things are supposed to work. And it actually is supposed to become a distinctive, right? That your pagan neighbors all operate in this way. You are not to operate in this way. Tom?
You go through and look at it, if we take, going back to Cain and Abel, we read over in, Romans, that faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of God.
Right.
We find in Genesis that Abel offered a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. Yeah,
that God had regard for him in his sacrifice.
We go over and read in Hebrews that by faith
he offered that sacrifice. Yeah.
So we could go through and come through to a, almost a definite conclusion. If faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of God,
and Abel offered by faith.
By faith, God told him what to do.
Yeah.
And God told him. Abel had the faith, he believed God and reacted obediently on that.
Yeah.
Cain had that same information presented to him, chose not to do it by faith, wanted to do it his way.
Yeah.
So the concept is there that, God had presented his laws to man. Man had either followed, and the thing is the story, the pattern that we've gone through from Adam, to Noah, now to Abraham, now to Isaac, and now to Jacob. God has revealed His law to man.
Right.
Those that live by faith follow it.
Right.
So when we start bringing the code of Hammurabi and other laws and things, God had revealed His laws to man. Man had taken and accepted some. Yeah. And had added their own laws to it. So historians like to go through that says that Israel copied from Hammurabi. Yeah. And that law, all they were doing was copying law. They don't look at the concept of, that God had provided that law to man. Right. And beyond the fact that when you do a straight comparison between the law of Moses and the other ancient Near Eastern laws, Israel's law has a lot of distinctives. Right? Israel is different in a lot of ways. If it was simple copy-paste, the law of Moses would not look anything like what it looks like. And it's like what the Hebrew writer says. God at various times in various ways revealed His will, right? And we're at this point where He is revealing it through the patriarchs. So let's go ahead and let's turn to our text, Genesis 29. We'll start in verse 31 again. We started the reading on Thursday, but didn't have any time to comment. Let's see. Let me get to the right spot in my notes. All right, verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, He has given me a son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Then she said, here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her, that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. And Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went out and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a 6th son.
Then Leah said, God has endowed me with good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards, she also bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, May the Lord add to me another son. All right. So in part, to make sense of what's going on in this story, in this wife-off, as it were, we have to remember the promises that God has given to Jacob. The promises that God has been giving ever since Abraham. And this is kind of an obvious question, but what promise is being fulfilled here and what is happening with Jacob? The seed promise, right? He's been promising Abraham that he's going to turn Abraham into a great nation. Right? And you might remember, he makes a similar promise to Hagar and to Ishmael. Right? And he promises specifically 12 princes will come out of Ishmael. And I think we've already read that is what happens, that he has 12 sons that become the 12 princes of his nation. And so here we're finally getting the fulfillment to Abraham, and we're getting kind of the flip side of that. We're getting something that's congruent to what has happened to Ishmael. We have 12, well, not yet 12. How many sons have been born? I don't know if y'all were keeping count through this point. We've got 11 up to this point. But we know it will become a 12th before everything is done. And these become, obviously, the 12 patriarchs of Israel. These become the source of the whole nation. So God is fulfilling this promise to Jacob. And it's important because when you go back to Genesis 28, remember God gives Jacob some promises. Verse 13, Behold, the Lord stood above it. It is above the ladder that Jacob saw, and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. All right, he's promised Jacob lots and lots of offspring, but he also promised this, Behold, I'm with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. And remember, we talked about Jacob in accepting God's covenant with him. It says in verse 20, all right, Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me this way that I will go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me I will give a full tenth to you. All right, so Jacob accepts the offer that God has given him, but he phrases it specifically in terms of, all right, God be with me, keep me in the way that I go, bring me back to my father's house in peace. All right, everything that God had said in verse 15. He doesn't hinge his acceptance of the promise on the offspring. I don't know if that's just not important to him or what. But up to this point in Jacob's journey, put yourself in Jacob's shoes for a minute. Up to this point in Jacob's journey, does it look like the Lord has been with him and prospering him? Or is it possible that Jacob could be questioning that? Consider what's going on with Jacob. He's been kept in the sense that Esau has not murdered him, and he has made it to Laban's house. But what's happening to him as a member of Laban's household? I mean, this is what we went over, I think, on Thursday. Yeah, he is oppressed in Laban's house. Right? He's fleeced. He's tricked. And of course, there's this irony built into it because Jacob is the heel grabber, right? The swindler, the master trickster. And he falls prey to his uncle Laban. And this whole time, and we'll see later in Genesis what Jacob's feelings were about this whole thing. He does not see this as a positive experience. Right? He understands that he's being abused. And so up to this point, from Jacob's perspective, I think it would be pretty easy for him to think that God has not been holding up his side of the bargain until now, all of a sudden, in a very short span of time, at least as far as the narrative is concerned, right? We're not given any sense of how long this takes. And I think Moses does that on purpose. And Moses knows how to keep track of time. Right? He'll tell us, whenever Jacob was so and so years old. Right? He does that with the other patriarchs. He does that with the other characters in Scripture. But here, we never get any sort of indications of the passing of time. I think Moses does that on purpose. We're supposed to get this sense that the sons are just coming very, very quickly. Right? That God just continually blesses Jacob with children. And he's blessing Jacob's wives with fertility. And remember, in the ancient world, fertility is a big, big deal. Almost every false god that the pagans worshipped was based in fertility. Right? Fertility of your wives, fertility of your crops, your land, fertility of your livestock. Practically everything goes back to fertility. Why did people pass their children through the fire to Molech? For fertility. They wanted Molech to bless their land, bless their crops, bless their livestock. It's a big, big, big deal in the ancient world. It's something we don't have to deal with a whole lot today. What's infant mortality look like today? It's not very high. We have extremely low rates of infant mortality. We're very, very blessed in that regard. Right? Whenever we give birth to children today, we don't worry, we don't assume in our gut, there's a good chance that this child will not live to reach age 5. In the ancient world, that's not the case. Right? I just remembered this off the top of my head, and I can't remember the name of the poet who wrote it. It'll come to me eventually. But one of the ancients wrote, "Whenever I see a cradle, I cannot help but think of a grave." And that's what he was referring to. Very, very high infant mortality. In the ancient world, you know what the chances are of Jacob having 11 sons and none of them dying? It's practically 0. Alright, this is God essentially slapping Jacob in the face and saying, look, I'm blessing you. Alright, because in the ancient world, if Jacob was just your typical schmuck, and had 11 sons, he would probably realistically get to keep anywhere between 4 and 6 of them. Infant mortality was that high. Again, it's just the expectation in the ancient world, a big, big chunk of your children will die. And yet, none of them are lost. Alright? Now, I want you to keep that in the back of your head, because whenever we get to the next passage, after we're finished looking at the sons, God is going to do exactly the same thing to Jacob's flocks. It's going to be really interesting to see that God is clearly being with Jacob in blessing him with so many children and keeping them all alive. All right, but this section where he's making Jacob's wives fertile, it begins with the beginning of this section is broken up with people seeing. Look in verse 31. When the Lord saw that Rachel was hated. Right, chapter 30, verse 1. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children. Chapter 30, verse 9. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children. All right, everything that goes on in this section happens as a reaction of sorts. And the first actor in all of this is the Lord. The Lord saw that Leah was hated. What is Leah's status? What should be her status in Jacob's household? Sorry? Yes, she was first wife. So, and remember, in the ancient world, again, polygamy is relatively common, and there are laws governing how you're supposed to treat your first wife. The first wife has a privileged position, right? And the cultural expectation. We're not talking about God's law. We're talking about the cultural expectation. Even the pagans knew if you took a second wife, you could not treat her better than your first wife. Your first wife is supposed to be the most important. She gets the privileges. Her sons get a better share of the inheritance, generally. Right? You can't put out your first wife in exchange for a second wife. And Jacob has done something that not even your typical pagan would think was right. And Jacob was doing something that even pagans knew was not right. Leah was hated. Rachel, whose second wife, was given first wife status. And again, why did Jacob give her first wife status? Why did Jacob prefer Rachel? Tom?
That's the one he loved. That's the one that he thought he was getting as his wife.
Yeah. She's the one that he loved, that he thought he was getting. Why did he love her? Again, because she looked good. Yeah. And that's what compels him. Again, we're not supposed to look at Jacob at this point in his life and think, my, what an upstanding moral character this is. Right now, he's going to be changed. And we're told in Hebrews that he is a man of faith. But at this point in his story, very, very low character. On the basis purely of Rachel's looks, he's willing to treat Leah like second wife. Tom?
Well, also, too, he's got some resentment that comes in because he was tricked into the situation.
Yes.
All right, so, he's probably doing a little bit of that to his father-in-law.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And it's clear he blames Laban for this.
If you had modern day psychiatrists and sociologists looking at that, they come up with all kinds of reasons why this is there and justifying his, behavior towards his media and things. And here it's, because of all these causes and things. Regardless of all that, he still had an obligation to them.
Right.
And that's sort of what, the Lord is going through and trying to.
That is exactly what's going on. Yes.
And we have a little hard time with it because the way the words are translated there. Hated is not so much like a total.
Yeah, he didn't have malice toward her.
It's a preferred less.
Yes.
And we have a problem with that because it's like the word love. We don't really. We've got all these different levels of love.
Right.
We sort of look at, but we use that same word.
Right.
The Bible uses different words that are very specific in that situation.
Right.
Hated is another word that's sort of like that.
Exactly. Like with Esau.
Like the concept, even with that, the Lord loved Jacob, but
Esau I hated.
Esau.
Right.
But it wasn't going through to the individuals; it was going to the descendants that came out of them because of their obedience.
Right.
So sometimes we get caught up on our perception.
We want to make it more romantic than it is.
The perception of the word, and that's not what's carried on there.
Right.
It's more of a less preferred concept.
Yeah.
Because if he hated her, why would he even go into her at all?
Yeah.
So, that's a concept that it's hard for us to picture and comprehend and understand because of how the word gets translated down to us.
Right.
Us going through it, looking at the context.
Right, yeah, we shouldn't think of this as primarily an emotional thing that Jacob is doing, but a matter of choice. Yeah, if we parallel it with what God says of Jacob and Esau, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. He's telling us, I chose Jacob, right, which we read in that oracle whenever Rebekah was pregnant with them. So he's chosen Jacob, and he hasn't chosen Esau, and that's it. It's not that he has any sort of emotional malice toward Esau. And again, it's not that Jacob has any particular malice toward Leah, but that he has chosen Rachel. And in doing this, is not treating Leah the way that she's supposed to be treated. Think of this for a minute in terms of, you remember the parable of the servant who's forgiven a great debt, and then he goes out and tries to strangle another servant that owes him a little money, right? You're supposed to have some empathy, right, if you've been in that situation. Right? In that servant's case, he has been under the crushing weight of debt, and he has experienced forgiveness, and he is supposed to be able to translate that into the way that he treats others. Even if he hadn't been forgiven of that debt, he should have empathized with the other servant because he himself has experienced that crushing debt. Right? He should know that person's in the same boat as I am. Consider Jacob's situation. It is an identical situation. Jacob hasn't been, forgiven of any debt or anything. But Jacob is being oppressed by Laban. He is not being treated the way he's supposed to be treated by Laban. Right? Laban is his kinsman. Laban is supposed to take good care of him, supposed to honor him, and instead Laban is oppressing him, swindling him. And so Jacob's in the position of the oppressed person. He ought to be able to empathize with Leah, and yet at this point he doesn't. Again, he's like the servant who goes out and strangles the other servant. Instead of preferring his first wife, Leah, he prefers Rachel. All right, so the Lord is fixing this, like He does in that parable. The Lord intervenes and says, "What you're doing is not right." So the Lord saw that Leah was hated. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So throughout this section, the Lord is doing what He's been doing since the Abraham cycle, opening and perhaps also closing wombs. The emphasis, though, in this passage is on opening wombs. The Lord opened Leah's womb. It doesn't say that He closed Rachel's womb, merely that Rachel was barren. And throughout the rest of the passage, we will read, for instance, in chapter 30, verse 22, God remembered Rachel and God listened to her and opened her womb. Right? Whenever the Lord is acting in this way, the emphasis is on opening the womb. All right, so in this first instance with Leah, we're given 4 sons. Reuben the firstborn, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And we noted on Thursday, all right, 3 of these 4 names have some reference to God. At least she gives some reference to God in what she says. Right, Reuben doesn't contain any of the name for God in it, but she says, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction. Right, Reuben means, look, a son. Because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. All right. She conceived again, verse 33, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, He has given me this son also. So she called his name Simeon. And in Hebrew, Simeon sounds similar to Shema, which means hear, listen. Like Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. Alright, so there's an explicit reference to the Lord, again, not necessarily in the name Simeon, but in what she says about Simeon. And then finally, in verse 35, She conceived again and bore a son, and said, "This time I will praise the Lord." Therefore she called his name Judah. Judah meaning praise. So again, she's explicitly saying the Lord is involved in this, and the name reflects that. The only exception is Levi, the third son. Verse 34, she conceived and bore a son and said, "Now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore she called his name Levi." All right, so 3 of these 4 children, their naming has some sort of reference to the Lord acting in Leah's life. But we mentioned on Thursday that there's one thing that all 4 names have in common. The thread that runs through all 4 of them, and it's Leah's relationship with her husband. "Because the Lord looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me." All right, because the Lord has heard that I am hated. Obviously, who's doing the hating? It's Jacob. "Now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I've borne him 3 sons." Now, remember, she says exactly the same thing whenever it comes down to the 6th son. So, this doesn't pan out well for her. "This time I will praise the Lord." Oh, you know what? My mistake. She does not mention Jacob in the naming of Judah. All right, but Jacob is at least given equal weight in Leah's eyes in all of these births. Wayne?
It says here, Levi sounds a lot like the Hebrew term that means being attached or feeling a passion for.
Yes.
Was that being attached referring to her husband? Because that's not what happened. Was it kind of like she's...
I think that's what she has in mind.
She has in mind, but that's not what happened. So the name is kind of like a lie. It's kind of like
it's wishful. It's wishful thinking in a sense. And again, that happens with, it happened with Noah, right? Noah's father named him Noah, intending for him to be a great figure. Noah's father didn't have any control over that. At the time of the naming, it was wishful thinking. Now, God ended up making it true. And in a sense, Levi's name also becomes redeemed in that way whenever we know ultimately what Levi ends up doing, like what the tribe of Levi becomes, the priestly tribe that attaches Israel to God, that intercedes. I think ultimately you can read it that way. Like if you're bringing an allegorical reading to it, that Levi becomes the priestly class interceding between man and God.
It was interesting how that he being attached not to his father but to his heavenly father. And that's the way I thought about it, but I didn't know if I was right.
I think that's a legitimate interpretation. That long run, Leah's naming of Levi pans out, just not in the way that she thought it would. So, Tom?
Culturally speaking, to Leah, look at what she's going through every time she has a son. All right, going through the importance of sons in that historical time. It's up through really the 17th, 18th, 19th century.
It's still true. Consider China's one-child policy.
Yeah,
millions of aborted girls.
Our history, the concept that came, a lot of this nation descended out of England. England had a big, King Henry was going through, that was his whole
right.
goal, to go through and have a son, to have a descendant, and he had daughters. And that's where Queen Elizabeth, first came out of that situation. But here, that's what Leah's going through and doing. Because of these sons, my husband will love me.
Yeah.
Right? Look what I've given him sons. I've given him sons. He can't help but love me.
Yeah.
But the concept, it took a lot more than that for Jacob to get over his resentment and the betrayal that he felt from not so much it, because the situation, it wasn't that he was ignoring her and not going into her and treating her like a wife. He wasn't treating her like the first wife.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why do we have this? She was barren. Barren indicates that
that there was some trying.
There was the trying going on.
Yeah.
Sometimes we take it overlooked. It wasn't that she was being neglected and he wasn't going.
Right.
There's some indication that might have been happening later on a little bit. Because with the mandrake type of thing.
Right. We get the sense that later on Jacob starts laying almost exclusively with Rachel. And that Leah is able to buy the privilege of getting to spend the night with her husband by giving Rachel these mandrakes.
Sounds like she was living in a separate place.
Yeah, it was normal for the wives to have their own tents. So each wife would have their own tent, and basically the patriarch would. It kind of depends how it would work out, but the patriarch would spend the night in one of his wives' tents. Let's see. Oh, and before we move on from this, I should mention also the name Levi does ultimately come to pass. It's fulfilled in the sense that Leah meant for it to be fulfilled, just not right now. We'll continue watching Jacob's story and see what happens with Rachel and Leah. In the end, there is something of a happy ending to this. All right, right now things look really sad for Leah. All right, the next person to see things was Rachel. All right, when the Lord sees, He is justifying, He's righting a wrong situation, right? He's taking an unjust situation and fixing it. When Rachel sees, what does she do? First off, she screams at her husband. Right, and remember Leah's attitude. I have given sons to Jacob, therefore he'll love me. So Leah sees it as her responsibility to give sons to her husband. Look at Rachel's attitude. Give me children or I shall die. So there are proverbs about this. What it's like to live with a wife with this kind of attitude. Actually, we'll have one of them in one of our readings today in the sermons. Jacob understandably gets mad at Rachel. Am I in the place of God to do this? And then look at what Rachel comes up with. Here is my servant Bilhah, go into her. All right, now Jacob should have known better, ultimately. All right, now this pans out in the scheme of things. There are sons given, but Jacob, we get the sense, should have resisted this. Right, because we've seen this plot before. Take my servant, I'll have children by my servant. Right, we've seen that with Hagar before, and how does that turn out? Disastrously. Right, but Jacob goes in for it, and gets two more sons, Dan and Naphtali. And notice what Rachel says in the case of Dan. God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son. All right, in a sense, I think Rachel recognizes that Leah's fertility is from God. She wants some of that preference herself, and she presumes to say that God has heard her voice. Now, Moses doesn't tell us that God heard her voice until down in verse 22. God remembered Rachel and God listened to her and opened her womb. All right, here Rachel is presuming. And then with Naphtali, with mighty wrestlings, that's the meaning of Naphtali. Mighty wrestlings, I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. And I think this sentiment, more than anything else, plays into that prohibition in Leviticus 18:18. That it's clearly a competition between these two women, at least in Rachel's eyes. All right, so that's 6 sons. We are basically out of time. The last thing I want us to note before we wrap it up for today, the next person to see, verse 9, when Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, notice what her reaction is. Again, we might want to think that, well, Leah will have a more righteous response than her obviously, low character sister Rachel. But Leah's response is to copy Rachel. She saw that she had ceased bearing children. She took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife, doing exactly what Rachel had done. And that gives Jacob Gad and Asher, good fortune and happiness. All right, so we'll stop it there for now. There's really not much to say about the remainder of this section. We might talk briefly on Thursday about the bit with the mandrakes and what's going on there. But I think by and large we're ready to pass on to the next section. Any questions or comments before we wrap it up? All right, thank you so much for all of your comments, questions, and your kind attention this morning.